Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Lots of music tonight, and we'll start with this.
The Monkees, the people say we're monkeying around, but we're too busy singing, put anybody down. We're just trying to be friendly, come and watch, sing and play. We're the young generation, and we've got something to say.
Well, they were the young generation, but they're not the young generation anymore. And Peter Tork became the second Monkee to die at the age of 77. We did a nice podcast on Davy Jones, who died a couple of years ago, and I urge you to listen to that. Peter Tork was actually the most diverse musician of the group. He played the most instruments, but he wasn't hired for that. He was hired to be a sort of a Harpo Marx figure. He was hired after his close friend Stephen Stills was turned down during the auditions because his teeth and hair didn't match the profile. Stephen Stills says it's because he wanted to submit songs, but I'm believing the first version. And one can only imagine what would have happened had Stephen Stills been picked, but he referred them to Peter Tork. Peter Tork played a sort of a sad sack humorous figure in Greenwich Village at the coffee houses, and it was perfect for television because he had the right hair and the right look. As I said, he was the most diverse musician. The best musician was Davy Jones, who'd done a lot of Broadway and shows before coming to the Monkees. And Peter Tork didn't get much musical exposure. They didn't let him sing too often. The one song that he sang a solo on was Ante Griselda, which I'm not going to play for you because A, it's not a great song, and B, he didn't do a very good job on it. But he did make two musical contributions to the Monkees. First is he accompanied Davy Jones on this great song by Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, Shades of Grey.
I remember when the answers seemed so clear. We had never lived without or tasted fear. But today there is no day or night. Today there is no black or white. Only shades of gray.
Hey, that's a good song. Peter Tork also contributed to what many people believe is the Monkees' most popular song. It was written by Jon Stewart, not the comedian, the member of the Kingston Trio. Peter Tork created and played the piano opening for Davy Jones on Daydream Believer.
Oh, I could hide beneath the wing of the bluebird as she sings. The 6 o'clock alarm would never ring.
One of Peter Tork's issues, and it was an issue for all the Monkees, except maybe Davy Jones, and it was an issue for the most of the public too, was that they thought that the Monkees were a rock band. But the Monkees were selected to be television characters aspiring to be a rock band. Actually, one of the guys to get it was John Lennon. When he met the Monkees, he said, well, you guys aren't a rock band, you're like the Marx Brothers, which is what they were. But Don Kirshner, whose podcast we've done, and his crew enabled them with the best pop songwriters in the business. The aforementioned Mann and Weil, Carole King and Jerry Goffin, Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart, Neil Diamond and Jon Stewart. That's some formidable talent. Then to play the instruments, they got the Wrecking Crew. So it's no wonder that with a popular TV show in 1966 and 67, the Monkees outsold the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and the only contribution they made to the records were their voices. This brought them a lot of opprobrium in the pop community because they were, quote, fake, and I think a lot of that was jealousy over their success. The fact of the matter was a number of the big bands of the era used the Wrecking Crew, bands like the Byrds, the Grassroots, and the Association. The only difference was the Monkees were doing it on TV. But the Monkees didn't get it either. They wanted to be part of the cool crowd, the Laurel Canyon crowd, the anti-war crowd, the protest crowd, the drug-taking crowd. I mean, they wanted to be nonconformists, when in reality, everybody was conforming to that. And so they rebelled. They actually took themselves too seriously. They did join that crowd, but that crowd sort of dispersed after about 2 or 3 years. So the Monkees were left without anything. And I think that in retrospect, they might realize that they made a very bad business decision by not following through with the original concept. I mean, if they'd played their cards right, they wouldn't have had to work again, or they could do whatever they wanted. And if that weren't meta enough, they ultimately did become a very popular rock group in revival and reunion performances where they played all the songs that the kids wanted to hear back in 66 and 67, which, as I said, are great songs. With the death of Peter Tork, we're now left with Mickey Dolenz and Mike Nesmith. as the surviving Monkees. We're going to move on to our feature, André Previn, who died recently at the age of 89. He was a conductor, a composer, and a pianist. He traveled between classical, pop, and jazz. He was best known for leading some of the top symphonies in the world, most especially the LA Philharmonic and the London Symphony Orchestra. He was a nice Jewish boy born in Berlin, managed to make it out before the war, came to LA, went to Beverly Hills High School, got into movie music, and from there his career took off. He won 4 Oscars and 10 Grammys. Here are Matthew Bannister and Edward Seckerson of the BBC4 Last Word to discuss the career of André Previn.
André Previn was one of the leading orchestral conductors of his generation. He was also an accomplished pianist, arranger, and composer. Through his appearances on TV, particularly with the London Symphony Orchestra, he brought classical music to a wider audience. André Previn was born Andreas Ludwig Priwin in Berlin. As he recalled, his musical talent was spotted at an early age.
We had music in the house at all times. My father was a lawyer, very successful, and he liked to play the piano, amateur piano, but very good. So we had a house full of leader, singer, and chamber music at all times. And I would be allowed to listen, which I did with great pleasure. And then I actually asked to have piano lessons, which is, in retrospect, a hateful thing for a child to do. But I did it not to get points, but because I really wanted it. And I was put in the conservatory when I was 6.
In 1938, Previn's Jewish father moved the family to Paris to escape the Nazis. A year later, they moved to Los Angeles, where André continued his musical studies. Then he found work providing scores for the movies.
He was attached to a studio, responding to commissions very quickly. I complimented him on his score for Elmer Gantry, the Burt Lancaster, Gene Simmons film, because it used only strings and brass. And he said, yeah, that must have been the week I discovered Hindemith's music for strings and brass. He said it used to keep us entertained, looking at various classical repertoire and saying, I could use a bit of that next week in this movie or that movie. And of course it gave him a great grounding as an orchestrator as well, because he was a wonderful orchestrator, and as a music supervisor and arranger.
And he wasn't a snob. I mean, he did the music for a Lassie film.
It was a film about the story of a disappointed opera singer who'd had a loss in the family and found her will to live back in the Ozark Mountains. There was some incessant barking, and almost no one spoke.
He also had a time as a jazz performer and composer, didn't he?
Yeah, and he had a natural feeling, and this is something you can't learn. The best jazz musicians often make the best classical musicians. I always remember Nigel Kennedy saying that you have to apply the same kind of freedom to a written down piece as you might to an improvised piece, because jazz musicians always come back. There's always a structure, a form to what they do.
What about the repertoire that he championed as a conductor?
The thing about Previn is, as his success grew and as his popularity grew, he never once compromised. In fact, he was quite the opposite. He would explore unusual repertoire. He brought Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony, a great piece which had barely been performed before he brought it to the LSO.
Another facet that made him more high profile than most was that I'm sure he was in the gossip columns quite a lot because of his many marriages, wasn't he?
Yes.
And he married Mia Farrow, he married Anne-Sophie Mutter.
Yeah. Well,
he had 5 wives.
Yeah, well, he was kind of irresistible on every level. He was irresistible to musicians, journalists, women particularly. Yeah, I mean, he was a charmer. There's no question about it. I must just tell you one story that he told me about when he invited some of his old Hollywood cronies to come over for a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony because he thought, this is a big deal for me. So they all arrived, and there were a whole bunch of them in the audience. And at the end, of course, everybody goes crazy at Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. One of his Hollywood cronies turned to them at the end and said, well, will you listen to this? Isn't this fabulous? Too bad André had to F up his career to get here, though.
A little bit of British snobbery there. Well, we're going to move on to Stanley Donen, who died recently at the age of 94. In the 1940s and early 50s, in the era of great musicals, he was the greatest musical director around. Here's the BBC with a brief report on the death of Stanley Donen.
The American film director Stanley Donen has died at the age of 94. Donen's works included musicals such as Singin' in the Rain, Funny Face, and Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. The director once told Vanity Fair magazine that watching Fred Astaire when he was 9 years old had changed his life. Stanley Donen was given an honorary Lifetime Achievement Oscar in 1998.
Besides snobbery, there's a little bit of ambiguity in these British. I think he meant when Stanley Donen was 9 years old, watching Fred Astaire changed his life. He was a nice Jewish boy from South Carolina, but his father took him up to New York City, and he hooked up with Gene Kelly. Gene Kelly took him out to the West Coast, and ultimately he directed one classic, Singin' in the Rain, a couple of really great movies, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, Funny Face, and Charade, and some good movies, and then as the 70s came along, some stinkers. Ironically, he was never nominated for an Academy Award, but in 1998 he did get a Lifetime Award, and he gave perhaps the most memorable acceptance speech ever. Here it is, with Martin Scorsese introducing him and telling his story.
I'm going to tell you a story with a happy ending. Once upon a time, a lonely boy in South Carolina was sparked by the wonder of movies, where he was captivated by everything from cowboys to comedians to movie monsters. And then he saw his first musical, Flying Down to Rio, which introduced him to two magical people named Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. They took the boy into a fantasy world of such delight that he changed his mind about going into his family's dress business and started taking dancing lessons. He was 9 years old. He kept on dancing, and when he graduated high school, the shy and awkward 16-year-old danced his way up north and into the chorus of a Broadway hit, Pal Joey. And it was there he met the star of that show, who was to become his mentor, friend, and in time, his collaborator on a series of films that would revolutionize dancing in the movies. The star was Gene Kelly. The boy was Stanley Donen, who followed Gene to Hollywood as his assistant first and then as his co-director. And the first film he directed by himself starred his boyhood role model, Fred Astaire. Stanley Donen had made the big time, and for the next 30 years, he directed and often produced a string of classic films. And here's that happy ending I promised you. An Academy Award for Life Achievement to Stanley Donen.
Tonight, words seem inadequate. In musicals, that's when we do a song. So, heaven, I'm in heaven, and my heart beats so that I can hardly speak, and I seem to find the happiness I seek when we're out together dancing cheek to cheek. I'm going to let you in on the secret of being a good director. For the script, you get Larry Gelbart, or Peter Stone, or Heiken Katz, or Frederick Raphael, like that. If it's a musical, for the songs, you get George and Ira Gershwin, or Arthur Freed and Herb Brown, or Leonard Bernstein and Conrad and Green, or Alan Lerner and Fritz Lowe, like that. Then you cast Cary Grant, or Audrey Hepburn, Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, Sophia Loren, Richard Burton, Rex Harrison, Gregory Peck, Elizabeth Taylor, Burt Reynolds, Gene Hackman, or Frank Sinatra, like that. And when filming starts, you show up and you stay the hell out of the way. But you gotta show up. You've gotta show up. Otherwise, you can't take the credit and get one of these fellas. Thank you very much.
And he did a little nimble, soft shoe there, and for a guy in the 70s, he looked pretty good, so it broke the crowd up. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. Look, there's only one song you can play as a final tribute to Stanley Donen. It's the greatest song from his opus magnum, and generally considered one of the greatest songs in Hollywood history. It's Gene Kelly singing in the rain.
He danced in puddles, which had to be the exact spot and the exact timing. We had to dig the cement out and make it for him to splash at that point.
I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling, I'm happy again. I'm laughing at clouds so dark up above. The sun's in my heart and I'm ready for love.